He kōna I purangi tēnei nā te reo irirangi o Aotearoa.
This whole place has been our teacher for 25 years because we knew absolutely nothing about native trees when we came, or plants, and still know very little compared with some of the experts that we work with. But we've been watching them for 25 years, and what you see is that if you sort of work with the land and you work with the plants and with the birds, you can achieve things so much faster.
Kia ora, nau mai haramai ki te ao hurihanga. Hello and welcome to Our Changing World, ko Clackin Cannon tēnei. We're hanging out in the Tairāwhiti region today. Later we'll head to Waikereru, a conservation area just outside Gisborne, to hear more from Professor Dame Anne Salmond about how they're recruiting the local manu to speed up forest regeneration.
The kiriru don't charge us anything. They just go up there, we feed them, and then they go up there and gloriously poop all over the place.
First though, we're starting in the city. A few months back, we did an episode about the Mātai Medical Institute in Gisborne. Using advanced MRI, machine learning and image processing techniques, the Institute is pushing the boundaries of research in many areas, but they have a special focus on brain health. And one piece of research is looking at ADHD, Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder, which an estimated 1 in 20 Kiwis have.
I've always been interested as why people with ADHD tend to present different motor skills. They fidget more, they walk slightly differently, and I was interested in understanding that using MRI.
This is Professor Justin Fernandez of the Auckland Bioengineering Institute, who's teamed up with Mātai Medical Institute.
People with ADHD present different gait. They kind of walk differently, they have a different sway. It's also been known in the psychology field that they tend to fidget more. So whether that's with their hands or their feet or any other kind of personalized fidgeting strategies. And I was always interested, maybe they're doing it for a purpose.
So the plan was to put some people with ADHD and without in an MRI and see what happened in their brains as they fidgeted. But if you've ever been in an MRI, you'll know that one clear instruction, beyond removing any metal, is to stay very still.
We figured out a way of getting someone to lay flat and isolating their feet so that they could fidget without causing any artifact in their head. And we got them to do an array of psychology tests, which elicits higher executive functioning in the brain. So we could see the brain being activated. And we did it once with fidgeting and once without fidgeting. And we got people who are neurotypical and people who are ADHD diagnosed, and we started to see differences.
When he says higher executive functioning here, Justin means something that causes the participant to focus and reason and make decisions. They use a common psychology test called a flanker task. There's a line of arrows. They can be lined up in the same direction, like all pointing left, or it can be in alternate directions. The person then must identify which direction the middle arrow is pointing.
And then we ask them to fidget. And the act of doing that actually causes their brain to focus and concentrate. And what we see in the MRI is suddenly an increase in oxygenated blood flow to the frontal regions of their brain, in particular the prefrontal cortex. It's generally known that people with ADHD, when they concentrate, they actually have an underactivation in that region.
So far, they've done the study with 75 participants with ADHD and about 50 age and gender match controls. The participants span from ages 10 up to 60, and they've got some really interesting results.
When those people with ADHD suddenly concentrated while fidgeting, the activation levels in that frontal region of the brain actually increased. Whereas in contrast, we found that a lot of people who are more neurotypical, their activation levels went down. It's almost as if the fidgeting was distracting for them. So we got two different behaviors.
There's another region of the brain associated with motor skills, with movement. And so Justin and the team used the MRI to investigate the connections between these two regions, the movement region and the higher executive function region.
People with ADHD actually have slightly more disorder in that connection. That means that probably they're fidgeting to try and actually improve the information flow through those neuronal pathways.
And information flow through neuronal pathways is what our brains are all about.
We have this organ that may be made up of between 86 and 100 billion neurons.
Dr. Gil Newburn is a senior clinical fellow at Mātai Medical Institute and part of the ADHD research team. He's a neuropsychiatrist who's interested in understanding the interactions between brain and behaviour so he can better help patients. And he loves talking about how the brain works.
Each neuron in the brain connects maybe on average with 10,000 other neurons. That makes 10 to the power of 13 connections potentially in our brain, and 1 with 13 noughts after it. And it's a number that's almost too big to get your head around if you can look at that irony.
Gill says it's useful to think of the brain working in a bunch of different but interconnected networks. We've all got a default mode network, a kind of brain standby that's on when we're not really focused on anything in particular, kind of daydreaming. But if something happens, maybe a loud sound in the environment, or we see something potentially dangerous, then the default mode network switches off and other networks kick into gear, like the salience network, which is the one that makes us jump before we even know what has made us jump. So this is all pre-conscious. The brain is wired to react fast, evolved to help our nomadic caveman ancestors respond quickly to dangers in the wild.
So if our salience network does, in our modern busy environment, the equivalent of saber-toothed tiger's going to have me for dinner, then that activates the next network, and that now brings things into consciousness, and that allows us to see the saber-toothed tiger, but also to look for your escape route at the same time. You can hold two things in consciousness. And you try not to look at the seagull flying past or the butterfly that looks an interesting colour. And that is essentially the role of attention. It allows us to stay alive and hopefully have a better chance of getting our DNA into the next generation.
For people with ADHD, the default mode network, that standby, ruminating brain state, sometimes doesn't deactivate when it should. So people with ADHD can stay in this daydreaming, wandering state. And for Gill's patients, this sometimes causes complications in their social and work lives, leading to the development of negative loops in the brain.
Living with ADHD is a stress. Stress changes the brain. The brain changes are especially in the salience network, so that defaults to, if I can't tell what's going on preconsciously, let's assume everything's negative until proven otherwise. That lowers the threshold for fight-flight reactivity, so people get much more anxiety, panic. It means the potential reward pathway doesn't fire, so people start saying, well, I'm depressed, I can't get any pleasure out of things. The ruminations go up, so every little stupid thing that we all get as human beings that they'd normally not worry about is suddenly there, and they can't leave that alone. And importantly, because the next pathway that's driving is that one that lets you hold the two things in consciousness, that falls off, so your attentional function gets worse.
One of the things that Gill is seeing in his practice are adults coming to the realisation that they have ADHD and have been living with it all their lives.
The common ones are parents, and particularly mums, where their child has been diagnosed and think, hang on a minute, I'm a bit like that, and so they want to come and get assessed. Or their employment gets screwed up. I mean, I've seen people have had something about 60 jobs by the time they're 30.
This is in part due to the fact that not all ADHD looks the same, and it can change throughout a person's life too. Here's Professor Justin Fernandez again.
Females tend to present with a more inattentive type of ADHD, whereas younger boys tend to present more with hyperactive presentation, and there's also a combined type as well. But what we find is as you get older, a lot of the males go more from hyperactive to combined or inattentive, whereas the females tend to remain more inattentive and combined.
And so part of what he's hoping to do with his ADHD and fidgeting research is to actually help with diagnosis.
Well, the holy grail that we're after is actually a really short MRI test that can help inform clinicians when they make decisions. So right now, you will see a clinician, a psychiatrist, a psychologist, and you'll go through a series of consultations and tests. But this can take time, and we also know it's in a very expensive process. What we're actually hoping is that one of those tests that the clinician could send you for is a very quick MRI that may, confirm or help them make that decision a lot quicker.
We've talked about the brain function arrow test, but that's not all they look at.
We start off with a map of the geometry of their brain, and then we do these functional tests. Then we look at structure, so we can see the neuronal pathways in the brain. And we even look at what is known as MR spectroscopy, which gives us kind of a map of the chemical signature.
Because MRI is not cheap, For this to be useful for clinicians, they need the time in the scanner to be as short as possible. Right now, the full array takes 40 minutes. They're aiming for about 15. All going well, they hope to do clinical tests across New Zealand at multiple MRI sites towards the end of this year. Something that Justin is learning from this research is just how diverse different people's brains are and how differently they work. For him, the fidgeting findings are an example of that.
Perhaps, when you see people fidgeting at school or on the bus, rather than looking at it as an annoying activity, actually understanding that, maybe they're more movement diverse and this is how they're doing things to cope.
Thanks to Dr. Gil Newburn of the Mātai Medical Institute and Professor Justin Fernandez of the Auckland Bioengineering Institute. Now we head just a few kilometres out of Gisborne to Waikereru, a conservation project on the private lands of Professor Dame Anne Salmond. Anne is a professor of Māori studies at the University of Auckland. She was New Zealander of the Year in 2013, and she was appointed to the Order of New Zealand in 2020 for her services to the country. Sporting a raincoat and gumboots to protect against this misty afternoon, she shares the backstory of how she got into conservation.
So Waikereru, this place here is a place that my husband Jeremy and I bought on a mad impulse 25 years ago, and I come from Gisborne, so this is my hometown, and I've got a big family here, and we were thinking about maybe buying some land and doing something, but we had no idea really what, and we walked into this bush because we used to come here as kids and actually as a young courting couple as well, and I wonder what's happening at Longbush. And we came up the road and there was a for sale sign on the fence, and walked into the bush, and a couple of kereru plonked down in front of us, and we thought, this is amazing, it's magic. And so it took us a year to buy it, but we put in an offer, very, very quickly after that.
Anne and I are strolling through Longbush Reserve, a small patch of bush, 11 hectares, that's been here since her childhood, that they've left open to the public.
When it was too hot to go to the beach, me and my brothers and sisters used to come up here on our bikes, and there was a wonderful swimming hole in the river right there, and lots of Gisborne kids came up here.
There's a really active understory going on here.
Yes, when we first came here the place wasn't fenced, and the understory was just completely bare. There was nothing, it was just leaves and that was it.
Fence in place to keep wandering livestock out, the reserve is recovering in its own time, with a bit of weed control help. A short stroll past a ginormous cabbage tree, possibly one of the biggest in the country, brings us to the wooden bridge that arcs across the small stream.
The stream that runs down here, when we first came, it used to dry up in the summer, and then since we've revegetated the hills, it flows all year now, and even after the cyclone it was clear. So here's the Gizzy Golden Gate, our little curved bridge, and that was built by the local Polytech. The fencing course came and took down the fence, and then the scaffolding course built about 3 scaffolds in the river, and the construction course mocked up the bridge and then brought it here and built it.
This kind of wider community involvement and educational element is a theme at Waikereru. The Welcome Shelter educational space was designed by Sarash Muller as part of his PhD project and built with a lot of volunteer and community help. This is where they host their Wild Lab Tiaki Tie-Out program, and about 1,000 school kids come through the program each year. The Harakeke Living Library was gifted by a local collector and is harvested by a local weaving group. And the 1769 Seed Archive, a garden featuring plants that grew in Tairāwhiti at the time that the Endeavour arrived, many of which are rare or endangered today, is supported by local botany experts. These are all on flat or gently sloping parts of Waikereru. But when Anne mentions the hills, this is the majority of the property. 100 hectares of steep-sided hills, which were bare paddock when they first bought it, and that they're now restoring to native bush. We stand at one edge of the meadow at the base of the hills as Anne points up towards the steep slopes.
When we first came, we planted these big groups of different native trees that had fruit for the birds, because we thought, well, there's long bush there, and if we provide food, we'll have birds sort of crossing in front of us all the time, which is exactly what they do. They like having this open space. So we planted, there's 20 puriri there, and there's quite a lot of kakatea just in that, sort of up that stream there. And it goes along and you see the karaka, tōtara, titoki. So anyway, so it's been fantastic. You can see how big they are and they're fruiting like crazy. And of course the kereru, they just flock here and eat and then they fly up in the hills. So up there we haven't really planted anything except we are doing these seed islands now, the seed island trials.
And that's, well, the theory and the practice of seed islands, right? So when you say a seed island, you're talking about planting a group of trees in one specific area that are going to grow up and bear fruit. And the seed island part comes in because they're going to then attract birds that will disperse your seed.
Yes, birds and other creatures as well, because they're not the only dispersers. But the thing that's been amazing about this is that the original plantings were just, we thought it'd be nice to feed the birds, basically. So we chose trees that cropped at different times of the year, looked at the QE2 handbooks and all of that kind of thing. And what we realised is that what comes back quickly is especially Mānuka and Kānuka dominant. And so you get these Kānuka shrublands, but they take quite a long time to turn into biodiverse natural forest. And to hold this landscape together, because it's so erodible, it's very crumbly, papa rock, you really need a very biodiverse natural forest with a whole complex underground architecture of roots. Because some of the trees have tap roots and some have surface roots, and there's the mycelial fungal networks, and you've got soil bacteria, all sorts of things happening underground, which help to hold the land together. So the idea of the seed islands is to find natural clearings in the regenerating shrubland. And then we had a geomorphological survey of the whole place by Mike Martin from Land Care Research. He did a brilliant job.
And what's a geomorphological survey?
That just looks at the land and it shows you what different types of geological formations you've got on it, I suppose. It's the soil types and what's the geology of this particular part of the land. And that gives you a bit of an idea about what might grow there. And then Marley Ford, who's doing his PhD, a lichenologist, did a botanical survey. And then David and Michael Bergen from Tane's Tree Trust then looked at the geomorphological survey, looked at the botanical survey, talked to those guys, and they decided what to plant in each seed island. And the experiment is to say which species do best where, because some of the seed islands are out in the open, some of them are sheltered, some of them are right in the bush, and we've got a big mix of species. So we're running a controlled trial, unlike our original, very spontaneous, let's feed the birds approach.
And the whole idea behind having the seed islands is to kind of fast forward that progress from the Kānuka shrubland to that forest that you need to, with all the different variety of roots to hold the earth together, basically.
Yes, and the biodiversity, because that's very resilient. I mean, the more biodiverse the bush, the more chance it has of adapting to climate change, because some species will flourish and others won't. And if you've only got one species and it doesn't happen to flourish, then you're done.
Now, the steep hills and pine plantations of this region have been in the news quite a lot in the last 2 years. To get to Waikereru, I followed Riverside Road alongside the Waimata River, which flows down through farmland and plantation forest, past Waikereru, through Gisborne City to enter the ocean at the harbour. The scars from the devastation of Cyclone Gabrielle were still evident on the drive in. Parts of the road were scoured out, and river silt stains were still to be seen, showing how high the water got when the river burst its banks.
Unfortunately, there's been a lot of harvesting, so there was a lot of forestry slash, which is just the waste, but also logs and also whole trees. Some of the plantations in this river, almost half of the trees just fell over and came down. And so our experience was that just upstream from our place, there was a huge enormous pile, I don't know how many thousands of logs and waste and trees that jammed right across the river and the road and blocked our neighbours off. They couldn't get into town. And then that burst and it came down and just scoured the river, took everything with it, including quite a bit of the road, some of our riverside plantings, part of our riverside fence. But that was nothing compared to what happened to many people upriver.
It's a tricky problem. The pine plantations bring money and work to the region, adding value to these steep areas that are hard to farm. But Anne reckons there are some solutions that could be looked at.
There's a whole lot of us that are working on trying to find really good solutions for te rāwhiti, but also for forestry across the country. And locally, it's Mana Te Ao Te Rāwhiti, which is the group that, after Cyclone Gabrielle, got that petition that got signed by 10,000 people very quickly and led to the ministerial inquiry into the forestry waste.
Well, East Coast residents are welcoming tightened forestry regulations, which will require slash to be removed after harvesting. Now, the government has announced the first set of changes to the industry after an inquiry into slash, which was prompted by Cyclone Gabrielle's devastating effects.
For this submission, the group summarised over 300 research papers on the topic, producing a wealth of evidence that suggested that what would be best for a region like Te Rāwhiti is a mosaic approach. Productive land should stay productive, for horticulture or farming. Yes, some areas should still have forestry plantations, because we need wood. But the gullies, the steep hills, the highly erodible areas, the strips alongside waterways.
That should have native bush on it, it should have forest. And we're trying to find ways of making that affordable for landowners. And so the idea of a gold standard carbon credit is something that's nature-based. It's not a monoculture, and it's one that's going to last for centuries and centuries, and not just 30 years and then get harvested, which won't solve the problem. People need jobs, and landowners need an income, and this costs as well. So recloaking Papatūānuku, I've had the privilege of being a trustee with Pure Advantage.
Pure Advantage is a charity with the stated aim of investigating and promoting opportunities for New Zealand to fulfil its potential for green growth. It's led by business and community leaders. It was founded by Philip Mills, owner of Les Mills Gyms. With Tāne's Tree Trust, they've researched and put together a proposal and business case for native forest regeneration called Recloaking Papatūānuku.
And the idea there is that they can see that instead of spending billions of dollars offshore buying international carbon credits that are probably going to be shonky anyway, it would be better to spend the money at home. And the way to fund that, we think, we've been hoping that the government would come to the party, because instead of spending billions of dollars offshore, it makes sense to use taxpayers' dollars at home, where it can create jobs and wealth. But that's a tall order at the moment. So the idea is, in any case, to have a carbon credit, which is very robust, which is nature-based, so that it's indigenous forest, and that it's properly monitored using satellite and other technologies which allow you to do that relatively inexpensively, but importantly gives landowners an income, a steady one, out to 2050, which is when our second Paris Agreement goal is. And we think that that would be workable. That would help restore this region and other regions that have been really hard hit. It would provide an alternative for this kind of topography, for this kind of landscape. And it's beautiful, as you see, just wonderful to be around, but also good for tourism. It has all the qualities, I think, that one could hope for in terms of diversity, and water, and air, and soil, because you're building soil instead of depleting it all the time. These forests create the most wonderful soil, and that's the topsoil that's getting washed down into the sea all the time, and it's costing a fortune.
For Waikereru, the immediate plan is to continue the Seed Island trial and research. The plants in the 1769 seed library will be cared for, school groups will continue to visit, and Longbush Reserve is still open to all. The Trust has also just secured funding to establish a wetland area near the 1769 seed archive, to which the Harakeke Library will be moved. But across our conversation, we've touched on climate change challenges and the biodiversity crisis. Big, gnarly, thorny issues. And I wonder how Dame Anne Salmond feels about it all.
Well, just lately I've been reading the Nobel Prize summit reports, and they're pretty dire. They're frightening when you look at the science, and everything that we think we know and understand as humans about the world we live in, it seems to be at risk. And you could get incredibly depressed about that, but what is so wonderful about this place is we're just sort of doing the things already that those Nobel Prize winners say that we should be doing, which is enhancing diversity, working with natural processes and strengthening communities, giving kids hope and optimism for the future, and knowing it's possible to have a different outcome. It's possible to make a real difference quite quickly, but for that to happen, people have to believe you can do it, and they need to understand that it's not that hard, and it's not that expensive, and that it's a joy.
Thanks to Professor Dame Anne Salmond. If you want to learn more about the 1769 Seed Archive Garden, Alison Ballance produced a beautiful piece about it for Our Changing World in 2017, when the garden was just 2 years old. I'll add a link to that in the show notes for this episode and in the web article, which you can find at rnz.co.nz/OCW. This episode was produced by me, Claire Kincannon, production help was from Ellen Rikers, and sound engineering was by William Saunders. Tēnā koe I whakarongo mai, I'm Claire Kincannon. Have a great week. Kia pai, te wiki.